The 1st of December 1967, Nakhon Phanom, Royal Thai Air Force Base, Thailand. On paper, this was not the front line of the Vietnam War. The jungle war was across the Mekong, beyond the borders, down in the mountains and valleys of Laos, where North Vietnamese trucks moved at night under triple canopy cover, and where American ground forces were not officially free to go in strength. But inside, a new intelligence center operated by Task Force Alpha, the war was beginning to change shape. It was no longer only a war of patrols, ambushes, artillery, helicopters, and infantrymen sweating through elephant grass. It was becoming a war of signals, a war of vibrations. A war where the first sign of an enemy convoy might not be a flare, a radio call, or a pilot's eyes, but a buried electronic sensor shivering in the dirt. The system that took shape there would become known as Igloo White, a highly classified American effort to wire the Ho Chi Minh Trail with air-dropped sensors, relay the signals through orbiting aircraft, process them in Thailand, and turn invisible movement in the jungle into targets for airstrikes. Official U.S. Air Force Museum material describes Igloo White as a three-part system. Sensors dropped along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, aircraft such as the EC-121 Batcat or QU-22B to collect and relay the signals, and an infiltration surveillance center that received and interpreted the data. The central question was brutally simple. Could the United States stop an army it could not fully see, on roads it could not fully occupy, in a country where the war itself could not be fully admitted? The answer Washington wanted was technological. The answer the jungle gave back was far more complicated, because Igloo White was not just a weapons program. It was a vision of future war, born in the frustration of Vietnam. It promised that sensors, computers, aircraft, and analysts could do what soldiers and bombers had struggled to do: find the enemy before he struck, track him through darkness and weather, and cut the supply arteries that kept the war alive. But like many visions born in Washington conference rooms, it had to survive contact with mud, deception, weather, terrain, politics, and a determined enemy who learned fast. This is the story of America's electronic battlefield in Vietnam, the secret sensor war that tried to turn the Ho Chi Minh Trail into a machine-readable target, and revealed both the power and the limits of technology in war. Before we go deeper into the hidden system behind this story, take a moment to leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications. This channel is built for the forgotten battles, the declassified files, and the pieces of military history that were never easy to explain on the evening news. To understand why the United States built an electronic battlefield, we have to begin with the trail itself. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not one road. It was a living network: roads, footpaths, river crossings, pipelines, storage sites, truck parks, bypasses, and repair points running through North Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and into South Vietnam. To American planners, it was the logistical bloodstream of the enemy's war. To Hanoi, it was a strategic achievement of endurance and organization. It did not need to look impressive from the air to be decisive. A truck could move under darkness. A bridge could be repaired before dawn. A crater could be filled. A damaged route could be bypassed. A convoy could stop under the trees and wait until the aircraft passed. The trail was not a fixed target. It behaved like a living organism. The American military had already tried to break North Vietnam's will and capacity through air power. Operation Rolling Thunder, the bombing campaign against North Vietnam, had absorbed enormous effort from 1965 to 1968. But it did not force Hanoi to abandon the war. By 1968, after the bombing halt, the focus of much American air effort shifted toward interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where men and supplies continued moving south. Igloo White arrived at exactly that moment, when the old campaign had failed to deliver the strategic result Washington wanted, and when the war was shifting toward finding and destroying movement through Laos. The problem was that Laos was officially neutral. That did not mean it was untouched by war. It meant the war there existed in a gray zone, bombed, monitored, fought over, but politically sensitive. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force states the challenge plainly. North Vietnamese trucks used darkness, jungle cover, and bad weather to move supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, while large numbers of American ground troops were not permitted into neutral Laos to stop them. That single limitation drove the logic of the electronic battlefield. If American soldiers could not occupy the trail in force, perhaps American sensors could. If patrols could not sit beside every road, perhaps buried machines could listen. If pilots could not see through jungle and weather, perhaps computers could infer what the eye could not see. This was the age of Robert McNamara, the former Ford executive who became Secretary of Defense under Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. McNamara believed in systems analysis, measurement, management, and the rational organization of immense problems. During the Vietnam War, the Department of Defense created and preserved enormous quantities of electronic data. The National Archives later described how, under McNamara's auspices, the military implemented extensive data collection intended to improve the conduct of the conflict, covering casualties, operations, and pacification programs. In that atmosphere, Vietnam became not only a battlefield but a data problem, a war that officials hoped could be measured, modeled, adjusted, and managed. Igloo White came out of that world. It was connected to a broader idea, often remembered as the McNamara Line, a proposed barrier system below the demilitarized zone that would combine physical obstacles, mines, sensors, strongpoints, and air power to reduce infiltration into South Vietnam. The concept went through code names and redesigns. The physical barrier proved far less practical than its advocates hoped. It required manpower, construction, defense, and maintenance in a war zone where the enemy could choose when and where to attack. By March 1969, Defense Secretary Melvin Laird publicly announced the cancellation of the barrier project, saying it did not work out as expected. But the air-supported sensor system survived. The wall of wire and steel faded. The invisible wall of signals remained. That surviving system was Igloo White. Its idea was elegant, almost futuristic. First, aircraft would drop sensors along suspected routes in Laos. These sensors were designed to bury themselves or wedge into the jungle while leaving antennas exposed. Some antennas were disguised to resemble small trees or bushes. Some sensors used seismic detection, sensing vibrations from men or vehicles. Some used microphones to pick up sound. Some combined acoustic and seismic functions. The U.S. Air Force Museum identifies examples such as a DESID, the air-delivered seismic intrusion detector, and a CUSID, the acoustic and seismic intrusion detector. In theory, a truck rolling down a road, a column of men moving through a pass, or voices near a trail could trigger the device. The sensor would transmit a coded signal. An orbiting relay aircraft would pick it up. The data would flow to analysts in Thailand. Then aircraft could be sent to attack. The machines were small, but the concept behind them was enormous. In earlier wars, an army watched the battlefield with scouts, cavalry, observation balloons, reconnaissance aircraft, patrols, agents, and radio intercepts. Igloo White suggested something different. A battlefield seeded with unattended devices, sending back signals without a human observer physically present. It did not replace courage, skill, or danger. Men still had to fly the aircraft, maintain the equipment, interpret the data, and drop bombs through enemy defenses. But it moved part of the act of detection away from the human eye and into a network. In that sense, the jungle became not just terrain, it became an input field. The aircraft that helped make this system possible were themselves part of the story. The EC-121 Batcat was a modified version of the Lockheed Warning Star, carrying crews and specialized equipment to orbit within range of the sensor fields. Air and Space Forces magazine described Batcat missions as long-duty days, with orbiting aircraft providing round-the-clock sensor coverage in shifts. Later, the smaller QU-22B Pave Eagle, a modified beach aircraft, was used as a relay platform. The QU-22B was designed with the idea that it could fly manned or unmanned, though operational flights had a pilot. In the cabin, space was taken up by electronic monitoring equipment. The Navy had a role as well. Naval History and Heritage Command identifies VO-67 as a clandestine Navy squadron based in Thailand, flying modified P-2 Neptune aircraft for missions connected to sensor placement. The aircraft used by VO-67 were not ordinary patrol planes in an ordinary mission. They were part of a hidden technical campaign, flying low and dangerous routes to seed the trail with devices that might later bring in airstrikes. The men flying those missions were not sitting safely behind the computers in Thailand. They were carrying the sensor war into hostile airspace. At the center of it all sat the Infiltration Surveillance Center at Nakhon Phanom. There, Task Force Alpha received the signals and tried to turn fragments into intelligence. The Project Checo report abstract preserved through the National Technical Reports Library states that Task Force Alpha began operations at Nakhon Phanom Royal Thai Air Force Base on December 1, 1967, and that the Infiltration Surveillance Center received sensor data, performed detailed intelligence analysis of enemy movement patterns, and relayed information to strike aircraft in usable form for immediate action. That sentence is dry, technical, almost bureaucratic, but it describes a radical shift in the tempo of war. Detection, analysis, targeting, and attack compressed into a loop. Inside that loop, the war became a pattern recognition problem. One sensor activation might mean little. A falling branch, an animal, a false signal, or a malfunction could all create noise. But a sequence of activations along a road could suggest direction. The time between activations could suggest speed. Multiple sensors firing in relation to one another could suggest a convoy. Analysts had to decide whether the jungle was speaking truth or lying. The computers could help sort and display data, but the interpretation still required human judgment. The system was automatic in theory, but war refused to become fully automatic. The war room at Nakhon Phanom became one of the strangest battle spaces of the Vietnam era. Air and Space Forces magazine described a darkened room with rows of scopes, large situation displays, and IBM 360-65 computers processing sensor data and electronic maps of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That description sounds more like early Cold War air defense than jungle warfare. Yet, that was exactly the point. The United States was trying to impose a command and control architecture on a battlefield where the enemy hid under trees, moved at night, and used terrain as a weapon. The promise was intoxicating. Instead of waiting for a pilot to visually spot a truck through jungle, darkness, rain, and smoke, the system could tell commanders that something had moved. Instead of bombing a road at random, aircraft could be sent to a suspected zone. Instead of relying only on periodic reconnaissance, the trail could be monitored continuously where sensors survived. To planners, this looked like the future. To crews in the air and analysts on the ground, it was also a grind. Signals, coordinates, false alarms, maintenance failures, lost links, and the constant pressure of making life and death decisions from incomplete evidence. It is important to say clearly what Igloo White could not do. It did not see the battlefield the way a camera sees. It did not identify every truck as a clean dot on a screen. It did not guarantee that every strike hit a real target. Brigadier General William G. Evans, speaking at a Pentagon briefing in 1971, explained that the system was not placing a point-target bomb on a precisely seen truck. The sensors were listening devices, not visual confirmation systems. They identified a strike zone where area weapons might be used. This distinction matters. The story is not that America invented perfect precision warfare in Vietnam. The story is that America built an early sensor-to-shooter network and tried to use it in a war where the enemy had mastered concealment. That is where the moral and strategic tension of the story begins. A sensor could detect movement, but it could not understand the meaning of war. A computer could correlate signals, but it could not know the full human reality beneath the jungle canopy. Analysts could infer, classify, and recommend strikes, but they were still working through layers of uncertainty. In the dark, a vibration became a code became a coordinate became a mission, and a mission became explosions in a place most Americans would never see. The first major test of the electronic battlefield came not only along the trail, but near Khe Sanh, where U.S. Marines faced one of the most dramatic sieges of the war in early 1968. More than 250 acoustic and seismic sensors were reportedly emplaced around Khe Sanh to detect enemy movement. With the data relayed by EC-121 aircraft and used for air and artillery strikes, Operation Niagara brought together intelligence, air power, and artillery in an effort to find and break North Vietnamese forces surrounding the base. Khe Sanh seemed, for a moment, to validate the concept. The United States had a besieged combat base, enemy forces moving in difficult terrain, and a need to detect attacks before they hit the wire. Sensors could contribute to early warning. They could feed fire support. They could make the unseen slightly more visible. For commanders who feared another Dien Bien Phu, the French defeat in 1954, that had become a haunting historical comparison, anything that helped locate enemy movement around Khe Sanh mattered. But Khe Sanh was also a special case. The battlefield around a fixed base was not the same as the vast trail network through Laos. A sensor belt around a known defensive perimeter was one problem. A sensor war across a sprawling, adaptive logistical system was another. The Ho Chi Minh Trail did not stay still. North Vietnamese engineers and laborers repaired roads, built bypasses, camouflaged movement, dispersed supplies, and adapted to American bombing. The trail was not a highway waiting to be permanently cut. It was an engineering and logistical campaign in its own right. If a route was hit, another could be opened. If trucks could not move in daylight, they moved at night. If large convoys were too risky, traffic could be broken up. If sensors were discovered, they could be destroyed, deceived, or avoided. The enemy was not a passive object in an American experiment. He was studying the system while the system studied him. The countermeasures became part of the legend of Igloo White. Air and Space Forces magazine reported that North Vietnamese forces were aware of the sensors and destroyed some while trying to induce false reports in others, including techniques such as driving animals up the trail and hanging buckets of urine in trees to confuse detection. These details sound almost absurd, but they reveal something serious. A high-technology system can still be attacked by low-technology improvisation. A sensor designed to detect traces of human presence could be fooled if the enemy understood what it was seeking. A network built to detect patterns could be fed false patterns. This is one of the deeper lessons of Vietnam's electronic battlefield. Technology can extend perception, but it also creates new blind spots. Once a command system trusts a signal, the enemy may begin to fight the signal rather than the soldier. He may not need to destroy every aircraft or every computer. He may only need to contaminate the data, force wasted strikes, move along unwired routes, or exploit delays between detection and attack. Igloo White was sophisticated. The enemy's response did not always need to be. In war, a cheap countermeasure can sometimes drain an expensive system. Still, Igloo White was not a simple failure. That would be too easy, and it would be historically careless. The sensors did detect movement. Aircraft did strike targets cued by the system. Trucks and supplies were destroyed. American airmen, analysts, technicians, and maintainers worked within an extraordinary technical architecture for the era. The U.S. Air Force Museum states that more than 20,000 sensors were dropped in Laos, with 80% operational after dropping. That number alone shows the scale of the attempt. This was not a small gadget trial. This was an industrialized surveillance and interdiction campaign. But scale is not the same as strategic success. The hard question is not whether Igloo White worked at all. The hard question is whether it worked enough to change the outcome that mattered. Did it stop infiltration? Did it break the trail? Did it prevent North Vietnam from sustaining the war in the South? Here, the record becomes contested. Air and Space Forces magazine notes that 7th Air Force reported thousands of trucks destroyed or damaged in dry season campaigns, but also that the published data did not say how many of those losses resulted from Igloo White sensor identification. It also describes skepticism from congressional staff and intelligence agencies over truck kill claims, including discounting by CIA and DIA analysts. The most careful conclusion is not dramatic but important. Airstrikes hit many trucks, and many other trucks got through. That sentence could stand over much of the Vietnam War. America inflicted enormous damage, but the enemy endured. America developed new tools, but the strategic problem remained. America counted trucks, sorties, sensors, roads, bombs, and targets. But the political will and logistical resilience of North Vietnam could not be reduced to a single metric. Igloo White made the trail more dangerous. It did not make the trail disappear. The human side of this system is often lost because the technology feels so cold. But every part of Igloo White involved people under pressure. Air crews flew long missions orbiting near hostile territory. Navy crews flew dangerous sensor-seeding missions. Technicians maintained fragile electronics in Southeast Asian heat and humidity. Analysts watched scopes and tried to distinguish real movement from noise. Pilots took coordinates and flew into flak. And on the other side, North Vietnamese drivers, engineers, laborers, and soldiers moved through one of the most heavily bombed logistical corridors in history, often knowing that the jungle itself might be listening. For the American servicemen involved, Igloo White was not just an abstract experiment, it was a mission. Many believed it saved lives by finding enemy movement before attacks could be launched. Around Khe Sanh, sensors contributed to the broader intelligence picture that supported air and artillery fires. Along the trail, sensor information could guide strikes at night or in bad weather, when visual detection was limited. There is a patriotic truth here that should not be erased. American engineers, airmen, sailors, analysts, and commanders were trying to solve a nearly impossible operational problem with the tools they had. They were not fools playing with toys. They were professionals confronting a brutal battlefield. But patriotism does not require pretending the system was magic. In fact, the deeper respect comes from telling the harder truth. Igloo White was courageous, ingenious, and limited. It showed American technical brilliance and American strategic frustration at the same time. It gave commanders information they had never had before, but it also tempted them to believe that more information might solve a problem rooted in geography, politics, enemy will, and the limits of air power. The phrase electronic battlefield became associated with this moment because Vietnam forced the United States to think beyond traditional front lines. There was no clear line of tanks crossing open plains. There were villages, sanctuaries, trails, jungle, tunnels, neutral borders, guerrilla forces, regular units, and political constraints. Igloo White tried to create a front line where the map had none. It tried to make infiltration measurable. It tried to turn the hidden movement of war into an electronic event. That idea did not die in Vietnam. It echoed forward. Modern warfare is full of sensors, drones, satellites, data links, command centers, infrared cameras, signals intelligence, unattended ground sensors, and kill chains. The vocabulary changed, the machines improved, and computers became unimaginably more powerful. But the basic logic, detect, relay, analyze, strike, was visible in Igloo White. Later generations would call it network-centric warfare. Persistent surveillance, time-sensitive targeting, or sensor-to-shooter integration. In Vietnam, it was still crude, improvised, and limited by 1960s technology. But the outline was there. This is why Igloo White deserves more attention than it gets. It was not merely a strange side project. It was an early glimpse of how the United States would increasingly try to fight, from distance, through networks, using sensors to compress time between detection and attack. In the skies over Laos and the rooms at Nakhon Phanom, the future was being assembled out of antennas, geophones, microphones, aircraft, computers, maps, and human judgment. And yet, The future arrived with old problems attached. A sensor cannot occupy ground. A computer cannot make an enemy surrender. A strike can destroy a truck, but it cannot automatically destroy the system that produced the truck, repaired the road, trained the driver, and accepted the losses. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not simply a transportation route. It was a national commitment expressed through logistics. Hanoi was willing to pay a terrible price to keep that route alive. The United States could raise the cost, but raising the cost was not the same as making the cost unacceptable. By 1972, the war changed again. North Vietnam launched a major conventional offensive, crossing the demilitarized zone and attacking in strength. American bombing priorities shifted northward in Operations Linebacker 1 and 2, hitting targets in North Vietnam as Washington sought leverage in negotiations. Igloo White operations diminished and eventually ended. Air and Space Forces magazine notes that the computers at Nakhon Phanom were packed up and shipped home. The electronic wall in the jungle faded into history. The physical traces were easier to remove than the ideas. Once militaries learn that a battlefield can be sensed remotely, they do not forget. Once commanders see data arrive from unattended devices, they ask for better devices. Once analysts build patterns from signals, they ask for faster processing. Once aircraft are connected to ground sensors through command centers, the chain can be improved, shortened, automated, and expanded. Igloo White did not win the Vietnam War, but it helped teach the American military how much of future war would be fought through information. There is a temptation, looking back, to mock the ambition of the McNamara era, the numbers, the charts, the faith in management, the belief that war could be optimized. Some of that criticism is deserved. Vietnam exposed the danger of confusing measurement with understanding. A spreadsheet can count sorties. It cannot tell you whether a government has legitimacy. A sensor can detect movement. It cannot tell you whether the enemy's will has been broken. A body count can be recorded. It cannot measure the political consequences of what produced it. But the opposite mistake is also dangerous. Technology did matter. Air mobility mattered. Communications mattered. Intelligence mattered. Sensors mattered. Logistics mattered. The tragedy of Igloo White is not that it was useless. The tragedy is that it was asked to solve more than technology could solve. It was a powerful tool placed inside a strategy that could not fully define what victory required. Imagine the scene again. The darkened room at Nakhon Phanom, scopes glowing, maps of the trail, coded signals arriving from sensors hidden under leaves and mud. Somewhere in Laos, a truck engine turns over. A driver waits for darkness. Men load supplies. Road crews stand ready to repair bomb damage. Above them, an aircraft orbits, listening for signals. Far away, analysts watch a pattern appear. They do not see faces. They do not see fear. They see activations, coordinates, and movement. The war has become information, and then the information becomes fire. That is the essence of the story. Igloo White transformed the jungle into a listening post. But the jungle listened back. It absorbed the sensors, hid the trucks, misled the machines, and forced the Americans to confront a truth older than electronics. War is never only a technical problem. It is a contest of adaptation. The side that is seen tries to become invisible. The side that watches tries to see more. Every answer creates a counter-answer. For the American military, the sensor war was an astonishing achievement of engineering under wartime pressure. More than 20,000 sensors dropped in Laos, relay aircraft orbiting for hours, computers processing signals in Thailand, analysts converting faint vibrations into strike recommendations, aircraft attacking through darkness and weather. This was serious innovation, built by Americans who believed that lives could be saved and enemy logistics could be disrupted by making the battlefield more visible. For the enemy, it was another obstacle to be studied and survived. North Vietnamese forces did not need to defeat Igloo White in a single dramatic battle. They only needed to keep the supply system functioning despite it. They repaired, rerouted, camouflaged, deceived, dispersed, and endured. That is why the trail became one of the great logistical stories of the 20th century. It survived not because it was untouched, but because it could be hurt and still move. There is a final irony in the name. Igloo White sounds cold, clean, almost sterile, but the war it served was hot, muddy, bloody, and morally complicated. The name hides the jungle. It hides the pilots. It hides the analysts. It hides the men on the trail. It hides the political discomfort of bombing Laos. It hides the desperation of a superpower trying to stop a supply route it could not occupy. And it hides a question that still matters today. When a nation can see more, strike faster, and process more data than ever before, does that mean it understands the war any better? Vietnam warns us that the answer is not automatically yes. The electronic battlefield did not end in 1973. It migrated, it matured, it became part of the way modern militaries think. But its first great lesson remains buried in the red dirt of Southeast Asia. Sensors can reveal movement, but not meaning. Computers can accelerate decisions, but not guarantee wisdom. Air power can punish logistics, but not always break strategy. And even the most advanced system on Earth can be challenged by an enemy with patience, discipline, terrain, and the will to adapt. That is why Igloo White belongs in the history of declassified war stories. It was hidden behind code names, aircraft designations, sensor types, and intelligence centers. It was overshadowed by Tet, Khe Sanh, Rolling Thunder, the Pentagon Papers, and the images of helicopters leaving rooftops. But in its quiet, electronic way, it was one of the most important experiments of the Vietnam War. It was America trying to build a battlefield that could hear. It was a glimpse of the wars to come, and it was a warning that seeing the enemy is not the same as defeating him. By the time the equipment was packed up and shipped home, the Ho Chi Minh Trail had already become more than a trail. It had become a symbol of endurance. Igloo White had become more than a program. It had become a symbol of technological ambition. Between those two symbols lies the real story. American ingenuity against enemy adaptation. Data against jungle, machines against men, and a war that refused to fit inside the systems designed to control it. If this story helped you see the war from a different angle, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications, because some of the most important battles were never told on the front page.